I'm finishing up my Victory Blue scratch build with some details and weathering on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure and subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you can catch future videos. Well, today I am excited to bring you the fourth and final installment in my Victory Blue Scratch Build series. This is a structure that I started building about 18 months ago. Got a little distracted in the middle, but we've come back and finished up over the course of the past few weeks. Now, the structure that I'm building is based on a prototype that is actually just off of North Yard, which I model in Saginaw, Texas. The prototype structure was built as a mill to process grain into livestock feed, and so it included a grain elevator for the handling of that grain. Later, it was sold to a company called Victory Fuels, which then transformed it into a facility to process diesel exhaust fluid, or DEF. And it's really interesting kind of a structure because it has this grain elevator look and yet processes something very different. It also has a variety of different types of cars, including box cars, covered hoppers, and tank cars that both bring in and load out commodities from this particular facility. So it's a great structure and a great industry to have for operations on the layout, and I'm very excited to have it. Now, if you haven't seen the first 3 segments of this series, I'm going to put the entire series together in a playlist, and I'll put that in a link in an iCard at the end of this video in the closing, so you want to be sure and check that out. Well, that's enough talk. Let's head on over to the workbench. We'll finish up the last little parts of building this structure, get some details added to it, and get it weathered and get it out on the layout. Check out our sponsor, Midwest Model Railroad. With some of the best prices and customer service in the business, they're your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com. Link in the description. When we last saw the Victory Blue structure, I had completed and painted the elevator head house, the processing and warehouse structure, and the external elevator leg and dust collector. I still had some building and much detailing to do, so let's get right to it. I painted the concrete foundation using some old polyscale concrete colored paint. I freehanded this with a brush. Brush painting, even primed styrene, makes it hard to cover, so I applied 2 coats. I didn't worry about eliminating all of the brush strokes, as this helps to create the illusion of the concrete texture. Next, I touched up some spots where I didn't get good coverage with the white paint, primarily around some of the piping details. For this, I used Model Master's flat white paint. The prototype structure has something dark above the roll-up doors. I don't have a good, clear picture of what it is, but I suspect that it's part of the roll-up mechanism, so I decided to model this with some quarter-round styrene. I measured the door width with some calipers and cut the strips to length. I then painted them with a micro brush using some Tamiya linoleum deck brown paint. While that paint dried, I turned to the door and window details. I used doors and windows from Tichy Train Group. The windows came with a glazing material that's pliable, not the typical acetate glazing, which would normally be a drawback, but for this application, it actually works really well. I used a touch of Aleene's tacky glue to attach the glazing to the window frames. I found it easier to attach the glazing to the frames while they were still in the sprues for easier handling. I let this dry for a couple hours before installing the windows. While they were drying, I prepared and installed the doors. I sanded the injection gates off the door castings. I then sanded the mounting holes to remove excess paint until the doors fit snugly in place. With the doors in place, I cemented them from the back using solvent cement. Now, I made a rookie mistake while doing this. Without realizing it, some of the solvent wicked all the way through to the front of the structure to my fingers, leaving huge fingerprints on the front of my structure. This is fixable, but it is a problem that you would really rather avoid. I sanded and painted over those areas where my fingerprints were, and then covered them with some weathering media to hide the flaw. When the glue had dried on my windows, I removed them from the sprue and sanded the injection gates smooth. When I installed the windows, I held any loose windows in place with a bit of painter's tape to avoid my previous mistake. I cemented the windows in place just as I had the doors, being very careful to keep the solvent cement away from the window glazing as to not further cloud the windows. With the paint dry on my overhead door hardware, I cemented those above the roll-up doors with solvent cement. In the previous video, I had attached the structure to a masonite base for easier handling, but now it was time to remove that temporary base for final assembly. I set up a joint of track and staged a couple of rail cars on it to help me get some measurements for the loading shed. I used those measurements to make some rudimentary drawings to guide me as I built this simple structure. I made a 4-foot high concrete foundation for the loading shed just as I had done for the warehouse facility. I cut this from 40,000th styrene. I cemented the ends of this foundation behind the front face. I then cut the remainder of the loading shed walls from the same board and batten styrene that I had used for the warehouse structure. You can find a link to this material in my Amazon pick of the week in the description down below this video. The loading shed is 65 scale feet long, 24 scale feet wide, and has a 22-foot high opening. I cut and test fit all of the walls for the structure, sanding and filing the edges for a straight, square, finished look. I used a 3-2-1 machinist block to keep the wall square while gluing the parts together with solvent cement. I first glued the end to the back side of the front wall. I then cemented the foundation which I had already assembled to these walls. Then I installed the other end wall. I could have braced these corners, and I intended to do so, but once the shed was assembled, it seemed sturdy enough that I was able to skip the extra bracing. I needed to add a short rear wall section as the loading shed extends well beyond the end of the head house. From the wall assembly, I measured and cut a roof that allowed about 6 scale inches of overhang on the 3 sides of the shed. I then cemented this roof to the shed walls. I cemented the shed to the side of the head house using a mounting strip, but unfortunately I didn't get this recorded. I then painted the foundation the same concrete color that I had used before. Next, it was time for weathering. I weathered this structure entirely with Monroe weathering powders. Formerly known as AIM powders, these are paint pigment powders that stick really well to styrene, far better than chalks like pan pastels or artist's pastels. I first used some white pigment to fade the gray steel doors. I then used medium gray to create some general weathering and streaking and grime on the sides and the roofs of the structures. I tried to think about areas where water would naturally run or would pool and applied my weathering in those areas. I weathered the foundation as well as the walls and the roofs. On the flat roofs, I used less of a streaking motion and more of a stippling action to simulate areas where dirt and water would pool and stand over time. I applied some grime to the external elevator legs and landings, and to certain areas of the front wall. Next, I used some dirty yellow pigment to simulate dust. In most cases, I applied this color lightly right over the gray that I had just applied. When using paint pigments for weathering, scrub them onto the structure, as this helps them to bond to the material. I used some medium earth pigment to simulate dirt on the foundation and the lower parts of the walls. And finally, I used a dark rust color to simulate, well, dark rust. This I used primarily on the elevator leg. For all of these areas of weathering, prototype photos are helpful, but it is especially helpful for weathering this external elevator leg, as the patterns of rust and weathering can be very distinct. Notice that I'm applying the rust below each of the support ribs, but not to the entire model. I'm also applying some of the rust to the handrails and the landings. The rust came out looking a bit stark, so I toned it down a little and added some texture by adding a bit of the dirty yellow on top of it. This created a very nice rusty look to the external leg. When I had finished, I thought all of the weathering could use a bit of toning down and blending, so I went over everything with a bit of the white pigment and blended it together with a wide brush. And with that, my structure for Victory Blue is complete. I may still tone down some of the weathering streaks on the warehouse structure, and I need to install the track and tank car unloading hardware, as well as scenic the area, but that will be the subject of a future video. I am very excited to finally have Victory Blue, the structure, completed and on my layout. And again, I'm very excited about getting the tracks in and actually getting this particular industry operational and functional on my layout. And we'll be sharing that with you in some videos very soon, coming up over the process of the summer. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I know you'll enjoy the rest of this series, and you'll find it in a play link in a card in the corner of your screen right now. Hey, be sure and check out the description down below, where you're going to find links to my Amazon page and my Amazon pick of the week, as well as my MicroMark promo code and tons of other great links that you will enjoy and benefit from. Be sure and check those out. Well, if you'd like to see some more model railroad content right now, check out the links on your screen. And be sure and join me each Tuesday as I bring you even more great model railroad content. And I look forward to seeing you then. 10, Lizzie?